Hello all, how are you all doing today? I'm doing well. Alexa, Leaky, Taylor, can y'all hear me? All righty, at least one of the others can hear us. So half must mean all are present and accounted for. I have to say, honestly, I'm surprised to see 4 of you here. So just to make sure you're in the right place, are you all planning on doing MD, PhD? Just thinking about it, just considering it. All righty. So, all right. Well, that's good to know. You'll find out a little bit more about what the application will entail for MD PhD today then. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome for our session today in the Preparing to Apply series. We're talking about research statements for MD PhD. In addition to also, there's a secondary statement that comes with the MD PhD application that some of you may not realize you have to write. So we'll talk about both of those here shortly. My name is Doug McLemore. I'm with the HPA here at UC Davis. I'm a staff advisor and also the test prep specialist, but I also come to you by way of having been formerly in the world of PhD. I went to grad school and I also taught at a university for a while. So I've been in that world. I know a little bit about it, of what that whole research side of things entails. So I think that's why I'm doing this particular presentation. So that's a little bit about my history that makes it relevant for what we're doing here. Now, when it comes to doing MD PhD, first off, just realize what you're applying for. I think that's the first thing to understand, is that when you're applying MD PhD, you're applying to go to school for at least 8 years, if not more. The first 2 years is basically going to be med school, what you would normally see in med school. And then the next 4 years-ish, depending on what PI you have and how successful your project is, and you know, a lot of other things, you're looking at doing essentially your PhD work. You're going to be doing your PhD work at that point. You'll defend your thesis, do all that kind of fun stuff. And then you would end up going into your essentially your 3rd year of medical school and finishing out what you would normally see. So you're looking at a minimum of 8 years, probably more, in order to complete an MD PhD. Now, I'm not saying that to scare you, just making sure you understand what MD PhD is all about, since some of us here are actually thinking about it right now, considering what that MD PhD route might be. So essentially, you're doing two full degree programs. You're doing a full degree program and an MD to get a doctorate in medicine. You're also doing a full PhD program to get a doctorate in whatever science you're applying to. Just curious, actually, what scientific fields are you interested in working in your PhD? Women's health, oncology, stress physiology, cancer biology, neuroengineering. Some very interesting choices for those research fields. Excellent. So, and that would be essentially your PhD route. Most of you would probably be in some kind of biological sciences department at that medical school, based on what I'm seeing there. So that's what MD PhD is about. Now, on your MD PhD, well, actually, let me rephrase that. Through AMCAS, you'd be applying to med school. You can indicate that you're applying MD PhD and at which schools you're doing it. So for all intents and purposes, you're only completing a couple extra things in addition to what you would normally complete for AMCAS. So you do your whole entire application as you would normally put it into AMCAS. And for schools that offer MD PhD programs, you can indicate that you're applying for that particular program. And even if there's a school that you do want to apply to that has MD PhD, but you don't want to apply to their MD PhD program, you just don't have to click that box. But the second you click one of those boxes, MD PhD, you have to do 2 additional essays. And this is what I think people don't realize. There's actually 2 additional essays, not just one. One of those is what they would call your MD PhD essay, which is basically, why do you want to do this dual program? Why not just be a doctor, or why not just be, well, why not be a medical doctor, or why not just be a scientist? So they want to know that combined thought. And then they also have your MD PhD research statement, which is, you want to have, well, if you're applying MD PhD, you should all have some significant research experience at some point in your undergraduate careers. So I'm assuming that all of you guys have had, you know, a pretty significant laboratory experience, knowing full well that COVID probably messed with things a little bit. So at least 2 of us, some of us might still be working on it. So that lab experience is what you would need to be able to write this MD PhD research statement specifically. So let's talk about this first essay. This is the one I think most people don't realize. It's very similar to the straight up essay you write for why do you want to be a doctor. But this one is, why do you want to be an MD PhD, really? So you get 3,000 characters, and it's pretty short. It's shorter than your regular personal statement. One of the bad things people tend to do with this statement is you start to write about, since like you just wrote about why you want to be a doctor, why you want to go to med school in your personal statement, people will tend to just do the focus of why I want to go do research in this personal statement. And that's actually a big problem with this particular statement. Because it's, if you were to write it that way, why you want to go do research, then you're actually saying to them, well, I actually just want to do the research side of things. The medicine isn't that important. So you're missing the point of the particular essay. You want to make sure from this essay that you're showing how much you love research and medicine combined in one unit. So notice how the first statement there says, don't write about how you love research and how you love medicine. Write about how you love both together as one thing. That's what you do want to do. You want to integrate that thing together. So the danger here is that we tend to write about the research is great and medicine is great, but you know, then why don't you just do one or the other? That's the question that raises in people's heads. The second thing people often do incorrectly with their MD PhD essays is write about research experience. This is not the time to talk about your research experiences. This is the talk about the time of why you're interested in some kind of combined synthesis of research with medicine, not like all the things you've done. Now, you might write about how that came from you doing a research project with such and such a professor, and that they instilled in you the love of medicine, medical research, but that's not right about your research experiences. That's using that as a jumping off point to explain why you're going this route. And the same goes for writing specifically about your medical experiences. This is not the time to write about that one moment where it was really cool when I did this and this and this, and that's not what it's for. But you might use that same, like, this medical experience taught me that there's more I need to know about, you know, the cutting edge of medical research, and so that's why I went this way. So it's not an either or. It's always, you got to be thinking of like, what is the combination of those? So like for you guys here today, like, why don't tell me what do you guys think sort of is the kernel, the nugget that's going to get you started on your particular MD PhD essay? What do you think you guys have here? Let's build on that. And don't be afraid to use your microphones if you want to.
Yeah, so I have an idea that I might use to start this essay. So I am a biomedical engineering, and I have been like working with other engineers and other like from biology professions too. But there's always this gap. So either you're focusing too much on the biology and you do not know what the clinic side is, even though like our lab is working with other clinicians. So like when you are a clinician and a researcher, you sort of like connect the gap between the two fields. Is that like a good idea?
Yeah, so you're showing how like you've always felt there was something missing, it sounds like, from biomedical engineering.
Yeah.
And that's a good kernel to get started with that essay. Like, what is that missing thing? And you can talk about how you discovered that, oh, if I just spent more time in the clinic because I was working at a student-run clinic or something like that, and
Yeah,
just jump off from there and show how those things integrate. Yeah, that's exactly what you're trying to prove with this particular essay,
yeah,
is that integration of things for sure.
yeah. I also have like personal experiences to talk about too, because like specifically just biomedical engineers, they do not like have like a good gist of what is actually happening in like medical facilities. Even like my senior design project, like we're working with ICU technology, but they do not know how the ICU technology actually works with the patients.
And you want to put that into it.
Yeah.
That's the core of your MD PhD essay, the 3,000 characters. But be careful, you can't say too much with this one. 3,000 characters disappears really fast. It goes away really fast. There's not a huge amount of space in this one, unfortunately. Anybody else have a sort of a nugget or a kernel that they have been thinking about for this particular essay?
I've also been thinking about on the same, I guess, string of thoughts with translational medicine, but mine's, I think, more on the aspect of like health education. I did in one of my classes, I did a lit review on like body image after breast reconstructive surgery after breast cancer. And one of the biggest things that I noticed was a gap in patient knowledge of like what the surgery actually entails and what happens afterwards. And so like one of the things that I want to do with an MD PhD is to help, I don't know, devise resources and conduct, I guess that's probably more of a social aspect of research, but I also want to do basic science in addition to this, but kind of like helping with health education so the patients really understand like what they're getting into and so that they can help be like their own advocates for their health. Kind of a long answer, but yeah.
Okay. So I get the thing that pops out to me is how does the PhD fit into that?
Yeah, so that's with the PhD, I really want to do more research into it's kind of difficult to explain, but the intersection of stress physiology and women's health and how that may relate to oncology as well. Because a lot of the research that I've looked into, they're really, so many things I want to do, really lacking in diversity in the research studies that they do. So I really want to have the PhD so that I can work in the laboratory and understand the underlying causes of certain diseases and stuff like that, and then apply that in a clinical setting. And then so I can also then take it further and help with patient education.
Okay. Sounds like you have a significant social component to what you're thinking about, and don't be afraid to include that in there. That like is your PhD could be on the social science side too if you wanted to go that route. It doesn't have to always be biological sciences that PhD lands in. So that could be a component of what you're doing, and so you might investigate some schools of like that are more open to sociology research. Or even psychological research, because that's in a way some of the things that you're thinking about. So like just be sure, because when you first described it, what I didn't hear was that connection of the PhD program into it. And remember that this particular statement has to say how both of these, like what are you going to do with both? Like what is it that you want to accomplish? Why are both of these things something you want to do?
Okay.
So make sure that that's like the core of what this particular statement says.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And sure. Any other people have a nugget that they want to discuss? I mean, this is the time. There's not a huge amount to say about these essays, so this is why I wanted to turn this more into like a share and discuss kind of session. So, any others? So I do have an example of somebody who did write an MD PhD essay like this. So let's critique this and see if it's doing the job that it's supposed to do. So take a minute and read this thing and see if there was anything you would change. What would you change, or what do you like in here? What are the particular things that are interesting to you? All right, so I've read through this. I'm assuming you guys are finishing this up. Give me some thoughts. Give me some comments about this. Do you think this does the job that an MD PhD essay needs to do? And if it doesn't, what are some, or, well, if it does, what are some things you think that does that well? And if it doesn't, what are some things you think could be edited in here?
Yeah, it does try to connect the two fields. One important point that I really like is the person mentioned about empathy, like learn a novel form of empathy. That is really important because like there are a lot of researchers, they sort of like lack empathy. They don't have like as many interactions with patients as physicians do. But yeah, it does try to do the job.
So one thing I want to point out about what you said is that the many researchers may lack empathy. You don't want to say it in so many words. That is actually what I would call a stereotype, that researchers are generally non-empathetic towards who may or may not use their research in the future, like as far as patients might be. And some people might take offense to it if they're reading that statement. So like, I think what this person did is they said it in a way that didn't say, yeah, researchers suck. Researchers are terrible. They have no empathy, but they introduced it and say, I learned this thing, instead of saying that otherwise they wouldn't have learned it, kind of thing.
Yeah,
I do think that's an important
I didn't mean to offend anyone or like. Yeah,
oh, no.
I was definitely not going to write it like that, but
yeah, that's not an offensive thing to me. I don't think you offended anybody in here, but I mean, there's a reason stereotypes get started, and as a whole, like my experience has shown me there is a lack of empathy in research, because they don't get out there. They're not involved in patient care directly in most cases. So
yeah, I also
that is
said
definitely something that
my
happens.
experience talking with like professors and like other engineers. Yeah. Yeah.
Other thoughts on this one, on this personal statement, or on this MD PhD statement, I should say?
It seems like it's like, I don't know, pretty distinct in like medicine experience or experience in medicine, experience in research, and like it is really short. I didn't realize how short it was going to be. But I don't know if it really has the integrative and synthesis aspect as strongly as it sounds like it should be.
I would agree. I do feel that this didn't integrate very well. That was the reason why I chose this particular one. Is it distinctly shows, okay, here was my research side, and then I didn't see a whole lot of the clinical side and why the medicine became a thing. They did say, I first saw firsthand when I started working in these exploratory apprenticeships and things like that. But I didn't see the culmination of putting the two together, of like how the PhD would serve them along with the MD. So I think this is an okay statement. I don't think it's terrible, but I do agree with Madeline a bit. I think it might be a little too subtle in what they're trying to say. You want to say more clearly that that both degrees are necessary to achieve something that they would like to do. Now, so like putting that together with what I think what Muhammad said was it edges on it. It's kind of like right at the edge where it implies that they picked up the empathy, and that's what they wanted to have in the realm of doing PhD work, so that they could bring it back to the clinic. But I don't think it says it as clearly as it could. It's just skirting the issue. In fact, I feel like that first paragraph is a lot of wasted space in this very limited 3,000 characters, because with 3,000 characters, that's a lot of setup just to talk about Lego and I Spy. And what was the payoff of that first paragraph? Where did the payoff of that paragraph happen?
It's the last sentence of the whole thing.
Literally one sentence was all they got off of payoff from that whole big buildup there. Those characters in the first paragraph could have been much better spent working on building out like just how that MD PhD might synthesize together in their head. So I think the three big paragraphs after that are good, as long as that next following paragraph might actually include a combination of like, here's how I envision using my PhD and my MD in tandem. And so, I think, you got to pay attention very much to the payoff of what you say in these things. This went very cliche with the started my life, and it went with that chronological thing that a lot of people go with. And I would say be wary of the chronological just for the sake of writing chronologically. You don't have to write chronologically and tell a story, as much as you still want to kind of have a story in it, but it doesn't have to be that good old classic tell a story in order type thing. Any other thoughts on this particular MD PhD essay?
I thought they included a lot of stuff that would also be prevalent in their work experiences.
Yeah, so I think it wasn't too bad. I think you're probably talking about in my tumor enchronology lab, I studied immunosuppressive effects of blah, blah, blah. And in the lab of Dr. Christina Nielsen, well, they didn't really say, well, they did, involving the development of thick tissue clearing. That's probably not necessary here. It might be more useful to use those characters to talk again about the synthesis of the two types of degrees. I don't think it's overly bad in this case, though. Dropping that in here is, not super, not something we want to avoid completely. I do think, yes, that's getting towards what we want to say more in the research statement, but it may not be necessary here. And if you don't need it, you might as well focus those extra characters on other things. What could have been a way to sort of finalize this if we took away the first paragraph and put in like the last 3 paragraphs and tacked on a 4th paragraph to summarize? What could that summary maybe have been to show more integration of MD with PhD?
Could you do like looking to the future and what he wants to do with an MD PhD?
Yeah, I think that is the piece that would probably most easily synchronize all that stuff together. Talk about how they could use an MD PhD to achieve their interests, to achieve their goals. So this would probably do better having gotten rid of the first paragraph and throwing that kind of a paragraph in at the end, for sure.
Yeah, I would also like use some of that extra space to talk more about the clinic side too, because like it kind of seems like he really wants to be a researcher, and like being a physician is just like an add-on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 2 full paragraphs about research and very little, well, almost 3 full paragraphs about research and very little on clinical. Because when I started my exploratory apprenticeship, that was the only time they're talking about clinical work is in that 1 paragraph. So it is a little bit lopsided that way. Nice. I didn't even catch that myself. But yeah, this is not a balanced MD PhD essay right now. I will say this person did go to an MD PhD program. They did successfully get in with this with this MD PhD essay, but it could be better and they could have gone to more. So, all right. Now let's talk about that other one, the one that we were officially here for today, and that's the research statement. This one's 10,000 characters. It's longer than anything else you're going to write, and you want to use all 10,000 of those characters. And this is the one where you're actually talking about your research. Like, it's the reason why we could probably take out, I studied immunosuppressive effects, and we could take out the protocol for thick tissue clearing, because now that's getting in more into the specifics of the MD PhD research statement, remembering that this one was just supposed to say you understand what an MD PhD entails and you want to show them why you're interested in doing both. This one's now just like, this is show off time. This is when you're going to say, here's what I know about research, and here's what I understand about research. What you got to be careful with these, though, is that the 2 of the biggest mistakes people make here is getting super duper technical. Like, you're going to have people that are not researchers reading these things. And so if you get super technical, start, listing tons of abbreviations and jargon and things like that, it's going to make it impossible for certain people to understand. They're not going to understand what the heck you're writing about. So therefore, they're not going to understand if it's a good research statement or a poor research statement, something like that. The other thing is, if you start talking about like all these, like the breadth of research, like all these different things that you've done, And it seems like that might be a good way to show that you've got a lot of experience in research. But what that's probably going to show is that you can't hold down a job in a lab, because you're just jumping from one field to the next, to the next, to the next, things like that. Those are the two big things I see individuals do incorrectly with these research statements. Some things that you do want to make sure you do: write about the depth, write about how you like went from developing the project to, you know, performing the project, to the results that you got, how it led to the next thing, and and then make sure to connect that research to your medical experience and how it applies. Even if it's not specifically to your own medical experience, but even to just medical experience you may have in the future, to again show that connection of MD with PhD. We want to integrate as much as possible. Yes, we want to make sure we talk about the research here, but we also want to have that undercurrent of like how that research can apply in a different context, in that medical context. There's one big thing that I feel that everybody needs to emphasize here. And that really is, how do I put it? It's not just the research, it's understanding the process of research. It's understanding how science is done. That's something you want to get across here. They don't want to know necessarily what you did as much as what you took, or like what you learned, the specific skills. And that isn't a bad thing. You know, if you're popping in that you have all these different wet lab skills or dry lab skills, things like that, clinical lab skills. But at the end of the day, something that they're looking for in every individual that does this route is they understand that the individual understands the concept of science. What do I mean, the concept of science?
I think you're talking about the scientific method, like hypothesis-driven research, and like everything is based on evidence, something like that.
Yes and no. I think that is important, that you have to understand the scientific method, how research should be done effectively, but there's something deeper than that. Were all of your guys' research, Madeline, what were you going to say?
I was going to ask if you meant like the trial and error process, like things don't go smoothly. You'll have to do the reaction 10 times and you still might not get it right. And you might have to start over from scratch.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Research doesn't always do what you want it to do. And that's not necessarily inherently part of the scientific method. It's just simply, that's the way things go in the lab. Things break, things get contaminated, things like, you understand that success is not the hallmark of good research. The hallmark of good research is stick-to-itiveness. Because I mean, honestly, how many people here had a fully 100% successful project?
I know I didn't. I ran into so many problems.
Right. But what do you do with those problems? When you run into a problem, what is it that you take away from that problem?
You learn how that problem happened and like prevent it in the next round of like.
Yeah, you learn from your mistakes. You figure out how to fix it ahead of time. You fix those mistakes, and maybe it's something you didn't think of, or maybe it's something that you had no control over, but now you know, so you can take control over it. Or it's all these different things that come into it, of like bad things happen in research, and you just got to learn to roll with it and do better the next time. And also a lot about like that stick-to-itiveness is just not taking it personal. Like nothing works right. Nothing works right in a lab, I swear, ever. There's another thing though that I want to make sure I include in here too. And that's like, how does a lab function? You ever heard this phrase, good, fast, cheap? Anybody know the next part of that phrase? Good, fast, cheap. You don't. Learn this one now. I'll type it in the chat box. Good, fast, cheap. Pick any two. That's the law of research. That's the law of the lab. And this isn't a bad thing to help a bad thing to illustrate that you understand in your research statement as well is that there's like, to give us some examples, like from undergraduate lab, like when you were taking organic lab, when you're doing distillation, you didn't do fractional distillation. You did simple distillation most of the time, which is fast because you had to be done in the span of a lab period. It's also cheap because you're one of thousands of students that are taking that class. So is it any good? Does it do a good separation? Absolutely not. It was terrible. You had so many contaminants in that thing. That's why you never get the stuff you're supposed to get in organic lab, because they're always going the fast and cheap route. They're never going the good route. So there's trade-offs. If you want to do something fast and cheap, you're not going to do a good experiment. If you want to do something good, it's not going to be cheap or it's not going to be fast. One of the two. If you do it good and fast, it's going to be expensive. Huge price tag. You're going to do something good and you do something cheap, it's going to be slow. It's going to be like the slowest thing you've ever done. And you know, bringing up this concept somehow in your MD PhD research statement is a good thing to do, because it helps, again, you understand a little bit about the how a lab works, the how the research world works. And this definitely rolls over in clinical research. If you want to, like, I mean, what is a current event that proves good, fast, cheap? Pick any two. The development of what? The development of the vaccine. Yes. And the COVID-19 vaccine. What would you say they chose at the trade-off there? They wanted what and what at the expense of what? They wanted good and fast. And so because of that, there was just an exorbitant, phenomenal amounts of money was spent to create that vaccine quickly and still make sure it's efficacious. Like, it's just insane that amount of money that went into this, that's still going into it to develop, you know, follow-up vaccines for variants and things like that. That's a major concept that if you can illustrate with the work that you've done, it can very much show them that you understand what it is to do MD, PhD type research. So like these are some guts to how you can really shine in these research statements. So let's look at a research statement, a sample research statement. This is only part of one. This particular person decided to show it as like, they did it kind of like a number one, here's this research experience. Number two, here's this research experience, which it can help identify things. I will say it does take away from your character count, although with 10,000 characters, that's usually not bad. So this is just one of those research experiences they had. Read through this. Tell me what you see. Do you think they did a good job illustrating that they understand science and they understand scientific research in this? So let's take a moment. Let's read that. I'll read it with you. Okay, I just finished up reading this thing. Assume you guys are a similar place. So tell me, does this do its job? Assuming that there's other stuff in this personal or in this research statement.
Haven't read any other research statements. It's the first time reading it, but this looks like the first two paragraphs at least look more from like a scientific paper, like just description of what the research did, a lot of technical terms, and then the last two paragraphs is just mentioned like what he did, but it doesn't reflect on any of the points that we just discussed, like about like the mistakes, the problems, like the challenges, and like the compromises, like what makes you a good researcher, what makes you a resilient researcher. That is really important to show in this statement.
So again, this does come from a research statement that did get accepted. This person was accepted in an MD PhD program, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement. So just goes to show you, like, this does work. I do think though, it did get really jargony, especially in those first couple sentences. Like, I do think bringing up the having that in there would be fine, as long as you're saying something else about it. This person is just saying, here's the research, here's some of the results, here's the publications we're gonna have, and you do want to include publications, but don't do it here. Where are you going to put publications?
In your experiences section?
Well, you have a space just for that, for doing publications. Like, there's no reason to toss in your publications into the research statement like this. I mean, if you've got the space, throw in that, okay, this research led to 2 publications. You don't have to be so specific as like in these journals, unless you're really trying to drop journal names. Like, okay, if you got research, if you're a primary author on a research paper that was dropped in JAMA, okay, drop JAMA in here. But other than that, like, it's not like the particular journal isn't important and all that fun stuff. But like, you know, telling where you presented, that's fine. And then when you got to the end, you got through this project, I learned this and this and this. It's showing that they've gotten a lot of techniques out of it, but I agree. The one thing I think is missing is, does this person show that they understand research? And I don't feel that they did a good job of that. That last paragraph is a little bit is extremely gratifying, not only in these new skills, take great ownership of a project I have in the past, going to a study from start to finish. Like, I want to see more than one sentence about this experience helping to better understand what goes into a study from start to finish. Expand on that. Give me more detail about that. That's what I want to know, because how did you learn that? What did you understand before and what do you understand now? That's going to tell me more about whether you're a good candidate for a PhD type program. So I think it's too heavy in the beginning, and I think it's too light at the end. If they had like weighted it a little bit differently and not spend as many characters on, you know, abbreviation dropping and things like that, and spend more on like what's the major punch points of that research, and then spend more time on the takeaways, not the learns. Like the skills, you should plop those in there, but the takeaway was missing, in my opinion. It was just not very solid. And I think Mohammed and well, all three of you had noticed that. It's like it wasn't really centered on what makes it good research, what makes you a good researcher. So, but do know that this was accepted, so you know it works. But you can just make it that much better if you include those other things, those core of what you understand from research. So I mean, that's really what I wanted to make sure you guys understood from today about the research statement and the MD PhD essay. So you've got those 2 additional things to write. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up for questions right now. Like, ask me questions. What are you still worried about with this particular statement? What do you still want to know about it?
I had a question about the research statement that you just showed. So the person didn't, like, maybe I missed it or maybe it's mentioned later, but didn't really show a connection between research and clinic. Like, since it's a research statement.
That actually was probably later on in the research statement, because notice this isn't even close to 10,000 characters.
Yeah.
This is about 2,500. They had 3 other sections like this, and the end actually had that. I just had limited space for cutting and pasting here. So this is just like one chunk. Say again?
how much should we be focusing on that aspect? Like how much of like the physician part should we be talking about in it? Because it is a research statement.
For some of you guys, you might not have enough research experience that was clinical related to actually say that medical connection. That's something that is a luxury for folks that have the ability to do that. You can speculate on the connection that you might be able to apply your research to clinical if you had that kind of work. But in this case, this person in this particular lab didn't have any clinical usage of that research. Like, let's say you did research in an organic chemistry lab. You would have no way to put that into clinical, almost certainly. So that you have to take that a bit with a grain of salt. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay. Okay.
That can't always be done. It would nice to be able to put it in as much as possible, but it can't always be done.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question about that. I actually work in an organic synthesis lab. But like it works with a base excision repair enzyme, and it does have like the stuff I work with, it works with the DNA repair. If there's a buildup of it, it can cause colorectal cancer. So is that a potential link I could draw on for the connection to medical experience?
You could, yes.
Okay.
You could say like, you know, this research led to, or could lead to some clinical applications and, you know, you could bring it into that. But, you know, again, it's going to be a little bit weaker since you didn't work directly in a clinical application of it, but at least point out that it could be there.
Okay.
Because it helps just to see that you're always thinking about it, that you're always looking for those avenues. Because if you're looking for them now, you're looking for them when you're practicing as an MD PhD.
Okay. And then, so I only have like one research experience, but I've been in the same lab since freshman year.
Which
and
is
so,
good. Yeah.
Right. So, and I have like, you know, I've done a bunch of presentations and we haven't published yet. So my concern is like, I might not have enough stuff to write about for the 10,000 characters since it's all on like basically one giant project. Should I try to break it down? Like there's a bunch of different like subsets, but in the project, should I try to break it down to that level?
I think if you've got something like that, you need to break it down into sub categories or sub projects that you have been involved in, because I'm sure you haven't been doing exactly the same thing the entire time.
Right. It's been like synthesis and then oligonucleotide work, and you know, we're starting enzyme assays, and you know, and there's a bunch of different synthesis projects and a bunch of different oligonucleotide projects.
Right. So, I mean, I would categorize it into those subsections of just like, and what you take away from each one of them. And honestly, that kind of gives you a better picture overall of how the research process works, because usually people are not involved in all parts all the time. Like the PI is, because, well, okay, you guys have learned about how PIs work, right? Do PIs actually get engrossed in the research itself? Are they the ones in the lab?
No.
Mohammed, how about you?
No, they are actually just advising on your projects.
Exactly. Rarely is a PI in the lab. So what they're doing is they're a manager. They're managing everybody, and to make sure that the big picture gets done, right? They're getting funding, they're hiring, like interviewing and hiring lab people, they're doing all these other things. And like, so even they are not part of the project, like in part of every single piece of the project. So, I mean, that's something that you could note in that, and for you, at least Madeline, is that you've been involved in different aspects of it, but that gives you a picture of how things are set up in a lab and how lab work works and how that might feed into clinical, and et cetera, et cetera. Again, it gives a picture of how you, like, that you know how a lab functions.
Okay. And then did you say that like we should try to take up the full 10,000 characters?
As much as possible. I mean, if you're starting to have to, you know, write fluff, don't do it.
Okay.
This is research, this is research, this is research, this is research 1,000 times. Don't do that. But if you, as much as you can, try to get to 10,000. because you don't want to let any possible thing slip by. But yeah, if you're fluffing it up, don't do that. Like bail
Okay.
at that point. At least 5,000 if you're doing it, if you have to cut it off short, but as much over 5,000 as you can.
Okay. And then I was also wondering, so I know like trying to stay away from too much technical jargon, but since I'm in the same research, I guess, overall project for the full thing, could I include like a paragraph like from, I don't know, like an abstract where it explains the background of the research with like in like common or in layman's terms, basically?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
and that's what you want to do, try to distill it down to layman's terms.
Okay.
This was written very technically. It's not layman's terms, and like the ability to write stuff to communicate information in layman's terms rather than all technical jargon is actually a very good skill. Like that's going to be looked upon as valuable. Scientific communication is, I mean, who's the most famous scientist in the world right now?
Dr. Fauci.
Oh no, he's not that famous. He's only famous because people don't listen to him.
I'm gonna go with Neil deGrasse Tyson.
That's what I'm talking about. Neil deGrasse Tyson. And why is he the most famous scientist in the world right now?
Because it can communicate
Because
to.
people like to listen to him. He communicates well.
Yeah,
He doesn't talk about people's head, and he's like the host of a TV show. He's the Carl Sagan of our time.
Yes, you should watch this. I'm actually watching Cosmos again right now.
Right.
Like the way he explains such complicated things, like it's amazing.
And if you can do that, if you can show you can do that, that's a very powerful thing. And because that's valuable. It's hugely valuable to the just science in general. Not to mention clinical science, because if you're working with clinical science, you need to be able to communicate with your patients and the clinics well, and the public at large. You know, I mean, we saw what happens when scientists don't communicate well with the public in the last year and a half. I mean, a lot of people get upset and a lot of people get angry. So that would be a very nice skill illustrated in here.
Okay, that's another question I had. I've like presented multiple times, so I was gonna ask, would that be worth it to like say like, oh, you know, I've presented and I've like developed this skill to communicate science in layman's terms to non-scientific community? Okay.
Yeah. Because that's part of your research experience.
And then would it also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Go ahead, you continue.
Oh, I also had another question. Would it be worth mentioning the fact that like, you know, research isn't done in a vacuum and that like you have to rely on other people and that it's like a group effort?
Yep, that's another valuable skill, showing that it's teamwork.
Okay.
Like not just showing, accepting that it's teamwork. Some people think they can just do it all on their own. It's not possible. It's absolutely not possible to do research on your own. I mean, what is it? Newton, did Newton say it, or is it said about Newton? Something about standing on the shoulders of giants. I think
Yeah,
it was Newton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like, if I can see farther, it is only because I'm standing on the shoulders of the giants or shoulders of people before me or something like that.
So Mohammed, you had something you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I had a question. So I've been also like working in the same lab for almost like 3 years and working on the same project, like continuing building. So I might have that issue of like not having like enough to talk about, like given the 10,000 characters. But I do have like future plans because so I'm applying this cycle and my like publication, hopefully everything would go through by the end of this year. And then after that, next year, like my gap year, I am starting to work on another project for like 6 months. So should I talk about the future too?
That would be a way that you can build out your essay a little bit, your research statement a little bit, is you do include that there is future work that you are doing. Don't say that I plan to do, just say like future work that will be performed during my gap year will be blah, 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 blah. Don't hedge on it. Just like, this is future work that I am going to complete.
Okay.
Because when you hedge, it's like, okay, if I get accepted, or if he gets accepted, is he really going to follow through with it? They might ask that question, but just say it in a way that's just like, here it is, cut and dry. This is the remainder of time I'm going to have, and here's what I'm going to do in that time.
I see.
All righty. Well, it is about that time. I do need to get on to drop-ins for HPA, but you got my email address here. You got my advising office hours. Feel free to pop in there and you can chat with me about your research statement, or I can do some editing, read it over and give you suggestions, or even just check grammar and stuff like that. Having been in the world of science, I can understand some of the jargon. So if it gets a little jargony, I should be all right. So, or you can actually, the drop-in study hall is for test prep, so I wouldn't come there with this, but definitely you can feel free to pop in advising office hours or drop-ins in the afternoons, because we do drop-ins every afternoon with Monday through Thursday. You can find those hours on our page. So thank you all for coming today. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to let me know.
Well, thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thanks for all the help. Have a great day.
Looking forward to reading some good research statements and MD PhD essays.
Okay.